A young nurse vanished after a quiet party, leaving behind a mystery that haunted a small town for 13 years. This is a story of courage, hidden truths, and the powerful voice of someone who refused to be forgotten. Stay with me until the very end. You won't want to miss how the pieces finally come together. Before we begin, let me know where you're watching from and leave a comment down below. I'd love to hear from you. Now, let's begin the story. It was the kind of summer evening that lingered on the skin like a warm memory, soft, golden, filled with the hum of cicadas and the smell of pine drifting down from the hills that wrapped around the small town of Meadow Glen. A quiet New England town tucked into a fold of the Vermont countryside. Meadow Glen was the sort of place where time seemed to flow a little slower and everyone still waved when they passed you on the road. That July, people were saying the summer felt unusually peaceful, as though the world were holding its breath. But then Clara Benson disappeared, and everything changed. Clara had been a nurse at the local clinic for nearly 9 years. She wasn't flashy or loud or one to draw attention, but somehow she had touched nearly every life in Meadow Glen. People trusted her, especially the elderly patients who spoke of her gentle hands and the way she remembered their stories. Mothers swore she had a sixth sense for comforting children in pain. Even the gruff town mechanic once admitted she was the only one who could convince him to take his medication. When word spread that Clara was leaving for a position at a larger hospital in upstate New York, the entire clinic staff decided to throw her a small going-away party. It was a casual affair, just a backyard gathering at her coworker Sarah Klein's house, with homemade potato salad, lemonade in mason jars, and music from an old record player that skipped every few songs, but no one minded. That evening, Clara had looked beautiful in a simple pale blue dress, her auburn hair pulled back loosely, her smile bright but distant. Several people noticed she seemed quieter than usual, more pensive. Just the nerves of starting over, Sarah had assured them, brushing off their concern. Around 9 o'clock, Clara thanked everyone, hugged her coworkers tightly, and said she wanted to take one last drive around town before packing the rest of her things. She promised to call Sarah the next morning to let her know she'd arrived safely in Albany. But morning came, and Clara didn't call. At first, no one panicked. Maybe her phone had died. Maybe she'd stopped to see the covered bridge one last time or taken a detour through the mountains. But by noon, Sarah's unease had hardened into fear. She contacted the sheriff's office. A missing person report was filed by early afternoon. By dusk, a full search had begun. They found Clara's car the next day on an old logging road just outside town, its tires half sunk in the mud, the driver's door closed but unlocked. Inside, her purse still sat on the passenger seat, untouched. The keys were in the ignition. Her overnight bag was gone, but oddly, her wallet and phone were in the glove compartment. There were no footprints, no signs of struggle, no blood. The surrounding forest was dense, ancient, a tangle of thick trees and moss-covered stones, and it swallowed sound as easily as it did light. Search dogs lost her scent within 50 yards of the vehicle. It was as if she had simply vanished into the trees. The town responded the way small towns do. Volunteers showed up in droves. Flyers went up in the post office and library. The local diner kept her picture by the register. People searched trails, combed ravines, and stood vigil with flashlights and hot coffee long into the night. But the days passed, then weeks, then months, and still nothing. Rumors grew like weeds. Some said she'd been kidnapped by someone from out of town. Others whispered she'd run off with a secret lover. A few claimed they'd seen strange lights in the woods that night. Sarah rejected them all. She'd known Clara better than anyone. Clara wouldn't have left like that. She wouldn't have gone without saying goodbye, without sending a note, without taking her favorite necklace that she always wore. Something had happened. Something terrible. But the trail grew cold. The sheriff, a tired man with too many files on his desk and too little evidence to work with, eventually told Sarah what she already knew but never wanted to hear. Without new leads, there was nothing more they could do. Life in Meadow Glen drifted back into its quiet rhythm. The seasons turned. New faces arrived. Old ones passed on. But some wounds don't heal. Clara's parents moved away 2 years later, unable to bear the silence in their home. The clinic where she had worked was shuttered after a new regional medical center opened 30 miles north. Her house was sold to a young couple who repainted the porch and tore out her garden. But for those who had known her, the memory of Clara Benson never fully faded. 13 years passed. Then one hot summer morning, in a small town in Tennessee, an old man with calloused hands and a heart that had known more goodbyes than hellos opened his mailbox and pulled out a letter. The envelope was yellowed at the edges, the stamp faded, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Bobby Mitchell hadn't seen that looping cursive in nearly 2 decades, but he knew it instantly. His hands trembled as he held it. The return address was blank, postmarked from Vermont, dated only a few days ago. Inside was a single sheet of stationery, lined clean, folded neatly, and it began with the words, "Dear Bobby, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but if you do, there's something I need to say." The letter weighed nothing in Bobby Mitchell's hand, yet it might as well have been a stone laid upon his chest. He sat on the porch of his modest home on the edge of town, his coffee forgotten and cooling beside him, his rough fingers trembling slightly as he unfolded the paper. For a long time, he simply stared at the handwriting, elegant, familiar, a ghost resurrected in ink. The way she curled her Ys, the careful slant of her Ts. It hadn't changed. Not all. After all these years, the breath caught in his throat as he began to read. "Dear Bobby, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but if you do, there's something I need to say." The words hit him with the force of a memory long buried, but never dead. Clara Benson, the girl he had loved in another life, it seemed, the one he should have held on to, but let slip through the fingers of youth and uncertainty. They had been high school sweethearts, inseparable during the summers, spending warm evenings down by the old creek or curled up on the tailgate of his father's truck under a sky dusted with stars. She was light and laughter and something steady in his turbulent world. But life pulled them in different directions. He'd joined the Army at 18, chasing escape and a sense of duty. She had stayed behind, tending to her family, eventually pursuing nursing. Letters turned into fewer phone calls, and time, as it always does, built walls between them. When he returned, scarred by war and burdened with silence, Clara had already begun a new chapter. They exchanged pleasantries at church one Sunday. Polite smiles, awkward nods, but the silence between them had said more than any words ever could. That was the last time he saw her. Until now. The letter was dated with no year, just July 3rd. It wasn't signed with a farewell, only C. The tone was raw, unguarded, and full of emotion. She had written about regret, about the ache of unfinished things, about second chances never taken. She wrote that she had never truly stopped thinking of him, that in her quietest moments she still pictured him with grease on his hands, laughing beside the engine of that rusted old Ford, talking about dreams too big for their small town. And then, as abruptly as it began, the letter ended. No explanation, no clear reason for writing it, no mention of her plans to leave Meadow Glen, or the new job in Albany, or anything that might have hinted at the storm that followed her departure. Bobby read it twice, then 3 times, as though somewhere in the folds of those few lines was a clue, a crack in time he could slip through to make sense of it all. He turned the envelope over again. The postmark was recent, just 4 days prior, and though it bore a Vermont stamp, there was no return address, no trace of who had sent it. What chilled him to the bone was the handwriting on the envelope. It was not Clara's. Someone else had addressed it. Someone had found this letter, held on to it for years, and only now decided to send it. Why now? Why 13 years after she vanished? The questions piled up in his mind like snowdrifts, quiet at first, then blinding. He had spent most of his life learning not to chase ghosts. After his wife, Anne, died 8 years ago, he had settled into a life of quiet rhythms and small comforts. The yard work, the weekly poker night with other retired servicemen, the dusty American Legion meetings. But Clara's letter cracked something open inside him, something raw and old and pulsing. He couldn't ignore it, not when every part of his soul told him that someone, somewhere, was trying to reach out across time. He called the post office the next morning, trying to trace the origin. They could only confirm the region. It had been dropped into a mail slot in Montpelier, Vermont. Beyond that, they had no way to help. He dug through his garage until he found an old plastic bin filled with mementos from decades ago. Photos, a yearbook, brittle Polaroids, letters yellowed by age. And there she was again, smiling up at him in grainy color, standing beside his old truck with that blue scarf tied in her hair, like she always wore in the summer. He turned the picture over. Clara, June 1983, written in his own scrawled hand. That evening, as the sun melted behind the Smoky Mountains, Bobby sat quietly on his porch, Clara's letter resting on his knee. Something stirred in him that hadn't moved in a long time. A restlessness, a need to understand, to unearth what time had tried to bury. He thought about the way she had vanished, about the empty car in the woods, the stories he read years ago in the local papers when her disappearance had made a small ripple beyond Vermont. At the time, he hadn't known she was missing until months after the fact. No one had called. They had drifted so far apart by then. He remembered reading the headline, "Local Nurse Disappears After Farewell Party," and feeling like the world had shifted an inch off its axis. And now, here was this letter. Not a copy, not a rumor, a living, breathing thing in his hands. He needed to go. He didn't have children to convince him otherwise. No job to keep him tethered. His house could wait. His garden would survive. He had to see for himself. To walk the streets she had walked. To stand where she had once stood. Maybe to find out why she left. Maybe to find out if she was still alive. Or maybe, just maybe, to finally say goodbye. He packed lightly, just a bag with a few clothes, the letter sealed in a protective sleeve, and the old photo of her by his truck. He locked the house, left a note with his neighbor in case anyone came looking, and pulled his battered pickup onto the open road, heading north. Toward Vermont. Toward Meadow Glen. Toward answers that had waited too long. The drive to Meadow Glen took nearly 2 days. Bobby Mitchell wasn't in a rush. He drove mostly in silence, letting the hum of the tires and the open highway carry his thoughts back to a time that no longer existed. Every few hours he would glance at the envelope resting on the passenger's seat, as if to reassure himself that it was still real. He hadn't told anyone exactly why he was going, only that there was unfinished business. No one pressed. At 71, Bobby had earned the right to chase ghosts if he wanted to. The Vermont border brought with it the smell of damp earth and pine, a green so deep it seemed to breathe. As he turned off the highway and onto the smaller roads winding through the countryside, a strange mixture of nostalgia and dread crept in. It had been over 30 years since he'd last set foot in Meadow Glen. The closer he got, the more it felt like driving into a photograph, familiar but somehow distant. Frozen. The town itself hadn't changed much. That was the first thing he noticed. The old gas station still had the same peeling sign above the pumps. The barber shop still had the spinning red and white pole, and the diner on Main Street looked almost identical to how he remembered it, right down to the crooked blinds in the front window. But what really got to him was the quiet. Not the peaceful kind he'd known growing up, but a stillness that felt like breath being held. He parked near the library, got out slowly, stretching his back as the weight of the road lifted off his shoulders. The air smelled like it used to, wood smoke, loam, something sweet in the trees. But something else hung in it now. A tension, subtle but unmistakable. Bobby didn't know if it was the town or just his own unease, but the moment his boots touched the pavement, he felt it. He started with the diner. That's where people always talked. If there were still whispers about Clara Benson, they'd be there. The place was nearly empty. Just an older couple in a booth, 2 teenagers fiddling with milkshakes, and a waitress behind the counter who looked like she'd been there for decades. Her name tag read Nancy. He ordered a black coffee and sat at the counter, glancing around without drawing attention. After a few sips, he finally spoke. "Been a long time since I was in Meadow Glen," he said, voice gravelly but calm. "Used to know someone who lived here. Clara Benson." Nancy's hand paused mid-wipe on the counter. She looked up slowly, eyes narrowing just slightly. "Clara," she said, almost like the name had dust on it. "Haven't heard that one in a while." Bobby nodded. "We were close a long time ago. I heard what happened. Never sat right with me." There was a beat of silence before she responded. Didn't sit right with a lot of us. She was a good one. Real kind. Just gone. Like that. She snapped her fingers softly. No one ever found a thing. Not a clue. Sheriff called it cold years ago, but folks around here, they never really let it go. Did she have any family still here? He asked, though he already suspected the answer. Parents moved not long after. House was empty a while. Someone bought it, flipped it. You wouldn't recognize it now. She paused, then leaned in just a little. But if you're really looking for answers, you might try Sarah Klein. She was Clara's closest friend. They worked together at the clinic. Sarah stayed in town. Bobby finished his coffee, paid in cash, and thanked her. As he stood to leave, Nancy added, "You'll find Sarah out on Willow Road. Lives in the old farmhouse. Tell her I sent you." Willow Road wound out past the edge of town, skirting a stretch of open fields and dense forest. The Klein farmhouse sat at the end of a gravel lane, a two-story clapboard structure with chipping white paint and a deep front porch. The garden out front was wild but beautiful, sunflowers and lavender bending in the breeze. As he climbed the porch steps, the screen door creaked open and a woman stepped out. She was in her early 60s, gray streaks in her shoulder-length brown hair, glasses perched on her nose, and eyes that held both warmth and weariness. She looked at him without speaking. "I'm sorry to bother you," Bobby said. "My name's Bobby Mitchell. I knew Clara a long time ago. Nancy at the diner said you might talk with me." A flicker of recognition crossed Sarah's face, followed by something else, something cautious. She didn't invite him in right away. Instead, she studied him like someone weighing memory against reality. Finally, she opened the screen door wider. "I remember you," she said softly. "She talked about you sometimes." Bobby followed her inside. The living room was quiet, filled with light from wide windows. Books lined the shelves. A photograph of Clara sat in a simple frame on a side table, her smile as radiant as he remembered. They sat opposite each other, and Sarah asked, "Why now? After all these years?" He reached into his jacket and carefully pulled out the letter, sliding it across the table. "I got this in the mail. A few days ago. It's from her. Her handwriting. But someone else sent it." Sarah picked up the letter, her fingers trembling as she unfolded it. Her face paled as she read, her eyes misting over. "This is real," she whispered. "I thought it was gone forever." Bobby leaned forward. "You knew about it?" "I helped her write it," Sarah said, voice thick. "The night before the party. She never sent it. She said she couldn't. She left it with me, told me to burn it if anything ever happened. I couldn't. I couldn't let go." "Then who sent it now?" Bobby asked. Sarah looked out the window, her expression troubled. "I don't know. But if someone found that letter after all these years, then maybe Clara wasn't the only one keeping secrets." The silence that followed Sarah's words settled between them like dust in an old attic, undisturbed for too long, too fragile to brush away without consequence. Bobby sat back in the worn armchair, his eyes tracing the outline of Clara's photo on the side table, his mind racing with the implications. Someone else had the letter. Someone who had waited 13 years to send it. That wasn't coincidence. That was a message, or a warning. Sarah held the letter in her lap, her fingers still curled around its edges like it might vanish if she let go. She hadn't aged badly, but Bobby could see in her face the weight of years spent waiting for answers, or maybe carrying truths too heavy to speak aloud. He recognized that look. He'd seen it in the mirror often enough. "She was scared," Sarah finally said, her voice soft, like she was confessing to the walls more than to him. "That last week, something changed in her. She never said exactly what it was, but I could see it in her eyes. She was afraid of someone, kept checking over her shoulder, jumping at small sounds. She told me she was leaving Meadow Glen, starting fresh. Said she had a job lined up in Albany, some private clinic. But that night after the party, she never made it home." Bobby leaned forward. "Did you tell the police about what she said?" "That she was scared." Sarah nodded slowly. "I did. They took my statement. But with no evidence, no body, no sign of foul play, they chalked it up to a runaway case. They figured she got cold feet, maybe changed her mind and disappeared on her own. They didn't know Clara. She would have never just walked away. Not without telling me." not without taking something. But her car was still parked at the clinic the next morning. Her bag, her keys, everything was still there. It was like she stepped into the dark and never came back out. Bobby rubbed his hands together, feeling the weight of 13 years settle heavier on his shoulders. And the letter? Why keep it all this time? Sarah hesitated. Because I couldn't let go. Not really. It was the last piece of her I had. And if I'm honest, a part of me always hoped someone would come asking. That maybe if the right person showed up, the truth would find a way out. Bobby looked her dead in the eye. I'm here now, and I'm not leaving without answers. Sarah nodded, as if she'd known he'd say that. She stood, crossed the room, and returned with a dusty shoebox. From it, she pulled an old, slightly faded photograph, Clara standing in front of the clinic, arm in arm with another nurse. That's Teresa Haviland, Sarah said. She and Clara worked the same shift the night of the party. She was one of the last people to see Clara that evening. But right after Clara vanished, Teresa quit. Just like that. Said she needed to move closer to her parents downstate. I always thought it was strange. Did the police ever talk to her? They did. Once. She told them Clara seemed fine at the party. Nothing unusual. But there was something off about her. Distant. Like she was hiding something. We were never close, Teresa and I. She always kept to herself. Bobby studied the photo. Do you know where she went? Sarah opened a small leather notebook, flipping pages until she found a name and address scribbled in faded ink. Last I heard, she was living in a place called Brighton Hollow, a little town about 40 miles from here. Then that's where I'll go next, Bobby said. You sure about this? Sarah asked, her eyes full of concern. You dig deep enough, you're bound to stir up things meant to stay buried. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I've spent most of my life living with what-ifs. I'm too old for regrets now. Sarah gave a slow nod and handed him the photograph. Take this. Maybe if she sees Clara's face again, she'll remember more than she wants to. Bobby left the farmhouse as dusk began to creep over the trees, the photograph tucked safely into the inside pocket of his jacket. As he drove back toward town, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the road like fingers reaching out from the past. He found a cheap roadside motel on the edge of Meadow Glen and checked in, the walls thin and the bed hard, but he didn't care. Sleep came slowly, restless and fragmented, haunted by half-formed memories and the echo of Clara's voice in his mind. Morning broke with the smell of coffee and a chill in the air that hinted at early autumn. Bobby set out for Brighton Hollow, winding through the back roads of Vermont, past crimson trees and fields beginning to brown at the edges. The town was even smaller than Meadow Glen, a tight-knit cluster of homes and shops nestled between two ridges. He stopped at a general store and asked for Teresa Haviland. The shopkeeper, a woman in her 70s with silver hair and a wary smile, pointed him toward a white cottage on the far edge of town. Bobby parked and approached the cottage slowly, noting the well-tended garden and wind chimes whispering in the breeze. He knocked twice. After a moment, the door opened a crack. A woman peered out, cautious, her hair pulled back, her features tense. Yes, she asked. Teresa Haviland, he said. My name's Bobby Mitchell. I need to talk to you about Clara Benson. Her eyes widened, just barely but enough to register. She didn't open the door further. Instead, she stepped back, like the name had pushed her into the past. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then finally, she spoke. I think you should leave. I got a letter, Bobby said, his voice firm but calm. From Clara, or something she wrote a long time ago. It found its way to me. I think someone wants the truth out. Teresa swallowed hard. Her hand trembled on the doorframe. You shouldn't have come. He didn't move. But I did. She looked past him, scanning the trees as if checking for shadows. If you really want answers, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, then meet me tonight. Back behind the church. 10 o'clock. But come alone. And before he could say another word, she closed the door. The rest of the day crawled by in silence. Bobby drove aimlessly through the streets of Brighton Hollow, past shuttered storefronts and narrow lanes lined with maples beginning to turn. He found a small diner near the center of town and nursed a bowl of chili and black coffee until the waitress gave him that subtle glance that said he'd overstayed his welcome. After that, he returned to his car and parked by the edge of the woods behind the old church, where the land sloped gently down to a narrow creek choked with leaves. He waited, windows down, listening to the ticking of the cooling engine and the distant call of owls. By the time the moon climbed high and bathed the town in cold silver, Bobby stepped out, stretched his back, and checked his watch. 10 minutes to 10. The church loomed above him, its steeple like a finger pointed at the heavens, the stained glass windows dark. He walked the gravel path around to the back, past crooked headstones in the overgrown cemetery. Every sound felt magnified. The crunch of his boots, the rustle of dry grass, the creak of a branch in the wind. It was the kind of quiet that carried secrets. At exactly 10 o'clock, he saw a shadow separate from the trees. Teresa Havlin stepped forward, bundled in a gray coat, her hands buried deep in her pockets. Her face was drawn, her movements wary. She didn't speak at first, just stood there, as if weighing the cost of what she was about to say. "I haven't spoken her name in over a decade," she said finally, her voice brittle. "I thought if I left Meadow Glen, changed everything about my life, maybe it would stay buried. But I see now, some things have a way of circling back." Bobby didn't interrupt. He let her speak on her own terms, knowing instinctively that any pressure might send her retreating behind the wall she'd clearly built. "I lied to the police," she continued, eyes fixed somewhere over his shoulder. "That night, at the party, Clara wasn't fine. She was on edge, nervous. I remember she pulled me into the hallway, asked if we could talk somewhere quiet. She said she'd discovered something at the clinic, something about one of the doctors. She didn't go into detail, just kept saying she needed to get out, that she was afraid she wouldn't make it to Albany. I told her she was being paranoid. God, I wish I'd listened." Teresa paused, swallowing hard. The breeze carried the scent of pine and something faintly metallic, like rust. After the party, she offered to give me a ride home. On the drive, she started talking again about how she was planning to turn in a report, maybe go to the authorities. She said someone had been falsifying patient records, prescriptions disappearing, things signed off by a doctor who hadn't been there. She wouldn't say who, but I could tell she was terrified. She shifted her weight, her voice thinning. We were almost at my place when she suddenly slammed on the brakes. There was a car parked across the road. Lights off, just sitting there. She cursed under her breath, reversed, and turned down a side road I'd never seen her use before. Said she'd take me the long way. I offered to stay with her that night, but she just smiled and said, "No, they'll be watching your place too." That was the last time I saw her. Bobby clenched his fists in his coat pockets, the cold suddenly forgotten. "And you never said any of this before?" "I wanted to," she whispered. "I almost did. But the next morning, I found a note in my mailbox. No name, no signature, just one sentence. Keep your mouth shut or you're next." There was a photo clipped to it. Me and Clara, standing outside the clinic. I knew that it wasn't just a warning. It was a promise. Her eyes glistened in the moonlight. I left town a week later. Never looked back. Until now. Bobby took a deep breath, letting the silence stretch between them. "You think it was someone at the clinic?" Teresa nodded. "Had to be. Clara wasn't the kind of person to make accusations without proof. If she found something, it was real, but I don't know who she suspected. She never named names." He thought for a moment, remembering the photo Sarah had given him. He pulled it from his jacket and held it out. "You recognize this?" She took it, her hands trembling slightly. "Yeah, that was taken a few weeks before she disappeared. Dr. Meriwether took it. Said it was for a staff newsletter that never actually got printed. He was one of the senior physicians. Always seemed like a decent guy, but Clara didn't trust easily. If she was afraid, it had to be someone with power, someone who could make her disappear. Where is Meriwether now?" "Still in Meadow Glen, last I heard. Runs a private practice out of his house. He retired from the clinic about 5 years ago." Bobby tucked the photo away. "I'll talk to him." Teresa grabbed his arm suddenly, her grip stronger than he expected. "Be careful," she said, voice low. "If someone waited 13 years to send that letter, they're not finished. This wasn't just a memory. It's a game, and you just stepped onto the board." He met her eyes, saw the fear still etched deep in them. But he also saw something else, relief. The kind that only comes when someone stops running. "I'm not afraid of ghosts," he said. They're not the ones you should be afraid of. She turned then, disappearing into the trees as quietly as she had come, leaving Bobby alone under the moonlight, the weight of her story pressing down like a lead blanket. He looked up at the sky, stars barely visible through the drifting clouds. The truth was out there now, crackling like distant thunder on the horizon. But something told him the storm hadn't even begun. The morning after the meeting with Teresa broke gray and damp, the kind of weather that soaked into your bones before you even realized you were cold. Bobby stood at the edge of the motel balcony, nursing a paper cup of weak coffee as he stared out at the mist rising from the trees. The conversation from the night before looped in his mind. Clara's fear, the mystery car on the road, the chilling note Teresa had received. Everything pointed back to the clinic, back to that one name, now echoing louder than the rest, Dr. Alan Meriwether. Bobby drove back to Meadow Glen with his windows cracked, letting the early fall air flood the cab of his truck. The drive was quiet, scenic even, but he couldn't shake the sense that someone, or something, was watching. He found Meriwether's address in a local directory at the general store. A simple white house on Cedar Run Lane, tucked at the end of a tree-lined cul-de-sac. The yard was trimmed, neat, too perfect in a way that felt unnatural. Bobby parked across the street and sat for a moment, watching. No movement, no sound except the occasional chirp of birds. He approached the house and knocked firmly. After a pause, the door opened just a crack. A man in his late 60s peered out, tall, thin, with wisps of gray hair and eyes the color of smoke. His expression didn't change when he saw Bobby. If anything, it hardened. "Yes," the man said, clipped and cold. "Dr. Meriwether? Who's asking?" "My name's Bobby Mitchell. I'm looking into the disappearance of a nurse, Clara Benson. You may remember her." There was the slightest flicker behind the man's eyes, too quick to name. But Bobby saw it. Recognition, discomfort, and something else, calculation. "That was a long time ago," Meriwether said. 13 years. Still unsolved. I gave my statements back then. If you're with the police, I suggest you go through the appropriate channels." "I'm not with the police," Bobby said. "I'm Clara's cousin." That gave Meriwether pause. He opened the door a little wider, but didn't invite him in. "I see. I'm sorry for your loss. But I really don't have anything to add. She was a fine nurse, bright, dependable. Everyone liked her. She was scared," Bobby said evenly. "The week before she disappeared, she told friends she'd discovered something wrong at the clinic." Meriwether's jaw tightened. People say all sorts of things when they're under stress. It was a busy time. We were short-staffed, running double shifts. Mistakes happen. She wasn't talking about mistakes, Bobby pressed. She said someone was stealing medication, signing off on patients that weren't even there. "Did she ever bring anything like that to you?" Meriwether stepped outside and closed the door behind him, his posture stiff. "I'm not going to stand here and have my integrity questioned by someone who wasn't even involved. Clara never filed any complaints. Not with me. Not with HR. If she had, I would have handled it. Professionally. She didn't trust the system," Bobby said. "Maybe she was right not to." Meriwether looked out toward the trees, his voice suddenly low. "Do you know what happens when you start accusing people in small towns? Even good people? Reputations crumble. Families suffer. One rumor, and you're branded forever. Unless the rumor's true." The doctor turned his gaze back, colder now. "Be careful, Mr. Mitchell. Digging into the past doesn't always bring peace. Sometimes it just opens wounds that never heal." "I'm not looking for peace," Bobby said. "I'm looking for Clara." Meriwether stared at him for a long moment, then stepped back. "Then I suggest you find someone who actually knows what happened. Because I don't." With that, he went back inside, the door clicking shut with finality. Bobby stood there for another minute, letting the man's words settle. There had been fear in his voice, but also defensiveness, like someone used to controlling the narrative, now unsure whether the story was slipping from his grasp. Bobby got back in his truck and made a note to follow up on Meriwether's time at the clinic, who he worked with, who might have covered for him. But first, he needed a breath, somewhere to think. He drove back toward town, stopping at a small veterans park near the lake. It was empty except for a pair of ducks drifting through the reeds. He sat on a bench, hands clasped, and pulled out Clara's letter again. The words still struck him like a wound each time he read them. Not just the fear, but the hope that someone might one day read this and understand. That someone would care enough to finish the story. He pulled out his phone and called Sarah. He knows something, he told her. Meriwether. He was nervous. Too smooth. Like he's had a long time to rehearse what he'd say if someone came knocking. I never liked him, Sarah replied, her voice hushed. Always had a way of smiling at you like he already knew your secrets. Clara used to avoid him when she could. Said he gave her the creeps. I'm going to dig deeper, Bobby said. Clinic records, maybe old staff rosters. Someone else had to know what was going on. There was a pause. Then Sarah said, quietly, you might want to talk to Linda Reyes. She worked in admin. She and Clara were friends for a while. But after Clara vanished, Linda got real quiet. Left the clinic a few months later, moved in with her sister upstate. I still have her number. Bobby jotted it down. Thanks. If anyone else contacts you, anyone strange, call me right away. He hung up and looked out over the water. The wind had picked up slightly, sending ripples across the lake like whispers. The deeper he dug, the more he sensed this wasn't just about a single missing woman. It was a web, carefully spun, still intact after all these years. But threads were starting to fray. As the sun dipped low and shadows lengthened across the grass, Bobby knew one thing for certain. He wasn't just chasing Clara's ghost anymore. He was disturbing something alive, something that had worked very hard to stay buried. And it wasn't going to let go without a fight. Bobby's next lead was Linda Reyes, the clinic's former administrative assistant and Clara's once close friend. He dialed the number Sarah had given him just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a muted glow over the quiet streets of Brighton Hollow. The phone rang twice before a weary voice answered. Linda's tone was cautious, but tinged with relief. The voice of someone who hadn't heard from anyone in years about the past she desperately tried to forget. Linda, this is Bobby Mitchell. He began carefully. I'm Clara's cousin. I'm trying to piece together what happened to her. There was a pause. I know it's been a long time, but if you have any information, anything at all, I'd be grateful to hear it. Linda hesitated, then agreed to meet at a small cafe on the edge of town. When Bobby arrived, the place was nearly empty, save for a few regulars nursing cups of coffee. Linda sat by the window, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug, her eyes red-rimmed but steady. She looked older than Bobby expected, the years etched in the lines around her mouth and the slow movements of her hands. I'm glad you called, she said softly. It's hard to keep silence when your conscience won't let you be. They talked for a while, Bobby careful not to rush her, letting her set the pace. Then she reached in her purse and pulled out a small, battered notebook, the kind with a cracked leather cover and yellowed pages. I kept this after Clara disappeared, Linda said. Her diary. She gave it to me, said if anything ever happened to her, I was to keep it safe. Bobby's heart pounded as he took the book, the weight of the past suddenly tangible in his hands. The diary wasn't just a collection of daily entries. It was a map of Clara's growing unease. She had written about strange incidents at the clinic, missing medications, unexplained absences, patients who didn't exist on the roster. One entry described a heated argument with a staff member she refused to name, but clearly distrusted. Another mentioned a late-night phone call from someone threatening her to stop asking questions. The words on the pages carried the quiet desperation of someone caught in a trap but determined to find a way out. Bobby read aloud a passage where Clara described her plan to gather evidence, to expose the truth no matter the cost. She wrote about her fears for Teresa, her hope that Linda might help if anything went wrong. Each page seemed to breathe life into the nightmare Clara had faced, one that had swallowed her whole. Linda watched him closely. She wasn't just scared, Linda said. She was hunted. Someone knew she was onto them. And I think they wanted her gone. Her voice cracked. I never told the police about the threats. I was afraid of what might happen if I spoke up. She looked out the window, lost in memory. When Clara vanished, the clinic tried to act like nothing had changed. But I knew better. I quit soon after. I just couldn't stay. Bobby nodded slowly, understanding the weight of silence. Did you notice anything suspicious about Dr. Meriwether? Linda hesitated again, then sighed. He always had a way of looking right through you. Like he knew what you were thinking before you said it. I remember Clara telling me once that he had a temper no one dared challenge. But people were afraid to say anything. Powerful men like him don't get questioned in small towns. She looked at Bobby. If you want to find out what really happened, you need to be ready for the truth. Clutching the diary, Bobby felt the pieces of the puzzle start to align, but also the risks multiply. This wasn't just a missing person case anymore. It was a story of power, fear, and a community's silent complicity. As the cafe lights flickered on and the evening deepened, Bobby made a silent vow to Clara and to Linda to bring the buried secrets into the light, no matter how dark the shadows grew. After leaving the cafe, Bobby felt the diary's weight not just in his hands, but deep in his chest. Clara's words echoed in his mind like a distant plea, urging him forward despite the growing shadows around the case. Linda's warnings clung to him, the caution to be prepared for a truth darker than expected. Yet, he knew he couldn't walk this path alone. There was one person he hadn't yet contacted, Detective Marlene Harper, the woman who had been assigned to Clara's disappearance all those years ago and whose career had quietly unraveled after the case went cold. Bobby remembered the quiet dignity in Marlene's eyes from the old newspaper clippings Sarah had found. He wondered if she had given up or if she, too, carried secrets about what had really happened. The following morning, he drove to the police precinct downtown, a modest brick building standing like a relic among modern glass towers. Inside, the smell of old coffee and paperwork was familiar, oddly comforting. He asked at the front desk, and after some hesitation, a young officer led him to an office at the back. The door opened to reveal a woman in her late 40s, her dark hair pulled back in a loose bun, her face lined with weariness and years of unsolved questions. "Detective Harper?" Bobby began, extending his hand. She shook it firmly, but didn't smile. "I'm Bobby Mitchell, Clara's cousin. I'm reopening the search for her. I believe there's more to this than anyone realized." Marlene studied him for a moment, then gestured to a chair. "I never stopped looking, even when the department moved on. Clara's disappearance haunted me. I always felt there was a cover-up, but I had no proof." Her voice was low, the burden of that confession heavy between them. Bobby laid out what he had learned so far. The letter, Teresa's story, Meriwether's evasiveness, Linda's diary. Each detail seemed to reignite a spark in Marlene's eyes. "This changes everything," she said quietly, especially if Clara was onto something inside the clinic. Back then, there was pressure from higher-ups to close the case quickly. No one wanted bad publicity from Meadow Glen Medical. The two spent hours poring over old case files, photographs, and statements. Marlene pointed out inconsistencies she had missed the first time. Witnesses who'd been coached, timelines that didn't add up, gaps in the staff's records. Someone didn't want Clara's suspicions to come to light, she said grimly, and that someone had influence. As dusk settled, Marlene leaned forward, her tone serious. "Bobby, if we're going to uncover the truth, we need allies inside the clinic. People who remember Clara and aren't afraid to speak." Bobby nodded, his resolve hardening. "I'm ready." Before leaving, Marlene handed Bobby a small envelope. "This came in the mail a few days ago, addressed to me. No return address." Inside was a single photograph, Clara, smiling faintly, standing beside a man Bobby didn't recognize. The back was scrawled with a cryptic message. Not all friends were white coats. Bobby's mind raced. The game was changing. This was no longer just about a nurse lost to time. It was about uncovering a network of silence and betrayal, a story that had woven itself into the very fabric of Meadow Glen. But now, with Marlene's help, he felt a flicker of hope. The truth was out there, tangled and painful, waiting for someone brave enough to pull it free. With the photograph burning a hole in his pocket and Detective Marlene's cautious support behind him, Bobby felt the weight of urgency settle deeper. The cryptic message on the back, "Not all friends were white coats," gnawed at him, suggesting Clara had confided in someone she trusted, or at least thought she could. But who? The clinic was a small world. Everyone knew each other, and yet, beneath that familiarity, secrets festered. Bobby's next step was clear. He needed to find out who the man in the photograph was and what role he had played in Clara's life and disappearance. That afternoon, Bobby returned to the clinic, now a quiet building humming with the routine of daily business, but carrying the ghost of past sins within its walls. He requested to see the current staff list, citing a general inquiry, but was met with polite refusals. His presence, it seemed, raised eyebrows, subtle glances passed between receptionists, hushed voices trailing behind closed doors. The air was thick with unspoken warnings. Undeterred, Bobby slipped into the local library, poring over public records and old newsletters. Eventually, he uncovered a name connected to the man in the photo, Dr. Samuel Cates, once a respected surgeon at Meadow Glen Medical, who left abruptly not long after Clara vanished. Bobby learned Cates' departure was shrouded in rumors, whispers of malpractice, disputes with administration, and most intriguingly, allegations of unauthorized drug use. None of it had ever made it to court, but the rumors were enough to ruin a reputation. Bobby decided he needed to find Cates, hoping the disgraced doctor might hold pieces of the puzzle no one else dared reveal. After tracking down an old address, Bobby found Cates living in a dilapidated house on the outskirts of a neighboring town. The place looked abandoned, weeds choking the yard, windows dusty and cracked. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with neglect. At first, Cates was defensive, suspicious of Bobby's questions, but when confronted with Clara's diary and the photograph, something shifted. His eyes darkened with a mix of guilt and fear. "I knew Clara," he admitted quietly. "She was the only one brave enough to question what was really happening at the clinic." He paused, swallowing hard. We all knew about the missing meds and the fake patient files, but no one wanted to confront it. The powers that be made sure we stayed silent. Bobby pressed him for details. Cates revealed a clandestine scheme where medications were being siphoned off for black market sales, patients falsified to cover tracks, and anyone who threatened to expose the operation was warned. Or worse, Clara had stumbled onto this secret, threatening to blow the whole thing wide open. "They wanted her out of the way," Cates whispered, voice trembling. "I tried to help her, gave her information, even some proof. But she was alone when it mattered." The old surgeon's revelations hit Bobby like a storm. Clara's disappearance wasn't a simple case of a nurse running away or falling victim to a personal tragedy. It was a calculated act of silencing a truth that could have destroyed lives and careers. Cates handed Bobby a small packet: documents, ledgers, photographs, proof of the illegal activities that had thrived under the clinic's sterile facade. Bobby left the rundown house, feeling a mixture of vindication and dread. He now held the evidence Clara had fought to collect, but exposing it meant confronting a powerful network willing to do anything to protect itself. Back at his motel, as night deepened and shadows stretched long, Bobby thought about Teresa, about Linda, about Marlene, and most of all about Clara, her courage, her fear, her silence that had screamed louder than words. The diary, the photo, the documents, they were threads leading to a tangled web of betrayal. Bobby knew the path ahead was dangerous, but he also knew one truth was clear: Clara deserved justice, and after 13 years, her story was finally coming to light. Bobby had barely slept. The documents from Dr. Cates lay spread across the motel desk, their contents a grim testament to a corruption deeper than he had imagined. He sat in the yellow hush of morning, coffee gone cold in his hand, staring out the window as a thin mist rolled across the parking lot. The silence outside matched the storm inside his mind. Everything pointed to a network within Meadow Glen: money laundering, pharmaceutical theft, fabricated patient care reports, all carefully buried for over a decade. And Clara, somehow, had gotten too close. But despite the mounting answers, one question still hovered above them all like a shadow. Why had no one spoken sooner? That question was interrupted by a knock at the door. Bobby rose slowly, his body aching from stress and too many hours hunched over paper. When he opened it, A young man in a Navy USPS uniform stood holding a small envelope. Delivery for Robert Mitchell. Bobby nodded. The mailman passed it over with a neutral glance, unaware of the gravity of what he was carrying. Bobby closed the door, turned the envelope in his hands, and froze. There was no return address. The postmark was smudged, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was Clara's. His heart hammered as he slit the envelope open with trembling fingers. Inside was a single sheet of aged stationery. The ink faded but intact, the words penned in the soft, precise script he remembered from his childhood. It began simply, "Dear Bobby," his breath caught. She had written him. Not a copy, not a photograph. This was the original. And judging by the fold lines and the brittle texture of the paper, it had been written years ago, but only just found its way back. She had written the letter 13 years earlier, dated just 2 days before her disappearance. In it, Clara told him about the clinic, how things had started feeling wrong, how certain medications were being restocked far too frequently despite low patient turnover, how Dr. Meriwether and a few senior staff always seemed to have meetings behind locked doors. She admitted to feeling afraid, unsure of who to trust, even among her co-workers. But she believed someone was watching her, someone who knew she was putting pieces together. She never named names. Instead, she begged Bobby, if anything ever happened to her, to believe she didn't walk away on her own. "I'm not running," she wrote. "If I vanish, it's because I was getting close. Don't let them tell you I was troubled. I wasn't. I was just tired of staying silent." Then she ended it with a line that broke Bobby's heart wide open. "You always believed in me when we were kids. If you're reading this, please don't stop now." He sat still for several minutes after finishing, the letter resting in his lap like a sleeping memory. The timing made no sense. Why now? Who had held on to this for over a decade and only just sent it? Had someone found it hidden away, forgotten in a drawer? Or had they finally grown a conscience? Bobby picked up his phone and called Marlene Harper. She answered on the first ring. "I need to see you," he said, voice rough. "Something just came in the mail. It's from Clara." They met at Marlene's modest home, where the living room still held boxes of old case files and photos. Bobby laid the letter before her like a sacred artifact. Marlene read it silently, lips moving, brow furrowed. When she finished, she sat back slowly. This confirms everything we feared." She knew, and no one listened. Bobby nodded, then hesitated. What if this wasn't just delayed by accident? What if someone meant for me to receive it now? Someone who's still out there, watching? Marlene considered that for a long moment. It's possible. Sometimes guilt waits until the fear fades, or until those in power move on and the ones left behind feel safe enough to speak. She reached into a nearby file box and pulled out a folder. "I think it's time we talked to Teresa again. She may have remembered more than she let on." That night, as Bobby sat alone with Clara's letter resting on his chest, he couldn't shake the feeling that the past was shifting beneath his feet, not dead but stirring. Like a wind rising through autumn leaves, the truth was rustling through years of silence, ready to be heard. Teresa Lancaster hadn't aged much in appearance, but when Bobby and Marlene arrived unannounced at her front porch, it was clear that time had worn down her spirit in ways no one could see from the outside. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured them tea, her eyes darting to the living room window every few seconds, like she expected someone to appear and drag her into the past she had fought so hard to forget. She sat across from him in her modest home, the ticking of an old grandfather clock the only sound filling the awkward silence that stretched longer than it should have. Finally, Bobby slid Clara's letter across the table. "This came in the mail yesterday. Clara wrote it 2 days before she vanished." Teresa's hands froze midway to her teacup. She stared at the letter, lips parting as though she wanted to speak, but had forgotten how. Marlene leaned in gently. "Teresa, we think she left that letter with someone she trusted. Someone who's only now found the courage to send it. And we believe you know more than you said before." Teresa closed her eyes, took a long breath, and let it out slowly. "I didn't mean to lie," she whispered. I was afraid. Still am." She looked up at them then, her eyes glistening. "But Clara was my friend. My best friend. and I haven't slept peacefully in 13 years. She paused, then reached behind her chair to pull out a small tin box, the kind people use to keep sewing kits or family recipes. But when she opened it, it held something entirely different. A worn cassette tape, a crumpled napkin with handwriting on it, and a small key wrapped in wax paper. Bobby leaned forward. "What's all this?" Teresa's voice shook as she answered. "The day before she disappeared, Clara came to my apartment. She was scared but determined. She said she had a plan. She'd found something, real evidence, but she didn't tell me what. She said if anything happened to her, I should take this tape and key to the press. But I couldn't do it. I didn't want to believe anything had happened. And when she was gone, I panicked. Hid everything. Buried it." Marlene took the tape gently, examining the faded label. "What's on it?" "I don't know," Teresa admitted. "I never listened. I was too afraid." Bobby's heart pounded. Everything was converging now. Clara's diary, Dr. Kate's documents, the mysterious letter, and now this forgotten tape that had sat in darkness for over a decade, waiting for the right moment to be heard. "What about the key?" he asked. Teresa looked down. "She didn't say, just told me to keep it safe." They returned to Marlene's home and dusted off an old cassette player from her attic. As the tape clicked into place and the reels began to spin, the room filled with static. Then Clara's voice, calm, steady, resolute. "This is Clara Whitmore," it began. "If you're listening to this, I've probably disappeared or worse. I hope I'm wrong, but I know I'm not. What I found at Meadow Glen Medical isn't just negligence. It's fraud, corruption, and something darker. I've documented what I could. Altered patient records, missing medications, unexplained nighttime procedures, and bribes exchanged behind clinic doors." Bobby sat frozen. Her voice brought memories rushing back. Her laugh, her warmth, her strength. Marlene scribbled notes furiously as Clara continued, naming staff members, outlining dates, and most damning of all, hinting a hidden file room beneath the clinic, accessible only with a maintenance key. "That's what the key's for," Bobby said, turning to Teresa. "That room. It must still be there." Clara's voice faltered slightly toward the end of the tape. "I don't know if I'll make it through this. But if I don't, please don't let my story die in silence. I believe the truth matters, even if it costs everything." When the tape clicked off, the silence in the room was deafening. Bobby swallowed hard. "We have to find that room. Tonight." Marlene nodded. "If those files are still there, they're the missing piece. But we need to be careful. If anyone at the clinic is still involved, we could be putting ourselves in danger." Teresa looked at both of them, then held up the key. "Clara trusted me with this, and I'm done being afraid." Later that night, under a veil of darkness, they returned to Meadow Glen Medical. The building stood quiet, locked up but not impenetrable. Marlene used her old credentials to gain access through the side entrance. Inside, it was a ghost town. The night staff was minimal, the halls dimly lit and eerily quiet. Clara's notes had mentioned a basement utility corridor behind the old records wing. They found it behind a rusted maintenance door. The air grew colder as they descended the narrow stairwell, the concrete walls closing in. At the bottom, hidden behind stacked janitorial supplies, was a steel door, unmarked, no sign, no welcome. Bobby reached out, slid the key into the lock, and turned. The door creaked open. What lay beyond would change everything. The air behind the door was damp and heavy, like the breath of a secret too long suppressed. Bobby stepped forward first, flashlight cutting through the darkness in thin, trembling beams. The walls were lined with cement blocks, and the narrow hallway stretched farther than expected. Old pipes clung to the ceiling like rusted veins, dripping occasionally with condensation that hit the floor in ghostly echoes. Behind him, Marlene and Teresa moved carefully, their footsteps muted against the concrete. They passed a row of locked cabinets and a cluster of broken office chairs, their metal legs twisted like forgotten limbs. At the end of the corridor, a battered metal door stood slightly ajar. Bobby's heart quickened. He pushed it open. What they saw made all three stop in stunned silence. It was a records room, but not like the digital, sanitized archives above. This one was analog, untouched by modernization. Floor-to-ceiling filing cabinets, sagging with the weight of thousands of folders. Shelves crammed with videotapes, manila envelopes, and black binders marked only with codes. A heavy metal desk sat in the center, its surface covered with dust, yellowed paper, and an old tape recorder. Teresa stepped forward, her eyes wide. This isn't just storage. This was meant to be hidden. Marlene began scanning the shelves, flashlight passing over dates that range back 2 decades. They kept a shadow system. Off the books. No digital trail. This could be the truth Clara was chasing. Bobby pulled open a drawer and rifled through folders marked with false names, some with Polaroids clipped inside. Patients, mostly elderly, faces vacant or frightened. The records detailed procedures they never consented to, medications far beyond standard dosages, and in several cases, experimental trials without clear authorization. One folder stopped him cold. It was labeled C. Whitmore. He opened it, hands shaking. Inside were handwritten notes, a copy of her employment file, and a surveillance report. It listed her comings and goings, times she entered restricted areas, names she had spoken with, Teresa among them, and a final entry dated 1 day before her disappearance. Subject growing suspicious. Recommending intervention. Teresa gasped as she looked over his shoulder. They were watching her, tracking her. Marlene found a stack of VHS tapes and grabbed one marked with the date of Clara's final shift. Bobby searched the desk until he uncovered an old television with a built-in player. The screen crackled to life, humming with static before revealing grainy security footage in black and white. They watched Clara walking through the night ward, her nurse's uniform pressed, her eyes alert. She paused outside a door marked Pharmacy, authorized only. She glanced around, then used a key card to enter. A timestamp in the corner matched the time of her final chart entry. The footage jumped. Moments later, a man in scrubs entered after her, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a surgical mask. Clara turned, startled. She said something, gestured toward a file in her hand. The man lunged. Teresa gasped. They watched in horror as Clara backed away, stumbled, and fell. The man grabbed her arm, dragged her out of frame. The screen went blank. Bobby sat frozen. She didn't just vanish. She was taken. Marlene looked pale, and they never reported it. They wiped the footage upstairs, kept this hidden down here in case anyone got too close. Insurance. Teresa sank to the floor, face in her hands. All these years, I thought maybe she'd run. Maybe she found a way out. But they buried her. No, Bobby said softly. They tried, but she's still speaking. Through all this. He turned, scanning the room. We need to take this to the authorities. The real ones. And the press. All of it. But Marlene raised a hand. We need to be smart. If we walk out of here with this, and they realize what we've found, someone could try to stop us again. We need to make copies, stash evidence in multiple places. And I know someone in the state attorney's office. Someone clean. Bobby nodded, adrenaline giving way to grim determination. Let's photograph everything. Tape what we can't take. Make a plan. They spent the next 2 hours documenting the room. Folders, tapes, files, anything with Clara's name or connections to the clinic's inner circle. Marlene copied pages with a small scanner she kept in her bag, while Bobby read aloud into a recorder, naming files and dates for a digital trail. Teresa cataloged patient names and codes, her hands steadier now than they'd been in years. When they finally emerged into the night, the stars above felt sharper, colder. The clinic stood behind them, silent as a tomb. Bobby glanced back once, then shut the service door behind him with a finality that felt earned. They split the files into 3 bags, agreed to hide them in separate locations overnight. Tomorrow, they would go public. They had everything Clara had tried to reveal, proof of what she'd found, what she'd risked, and what it had cost her. As Bobby drove through the quiet streets, Clara's voice echoed in his head. I believe the truth matters, even if it costs everything. He whispered into the night. We heard you, Clara, and we won't stop now. The next morning broke with a dense, gray fog blanketing the small town like a shroud of caution. Bobby stood at his kitchen table, carefully laying out every duplicate copy they had made the night before, photographs of records, USB drives with scanned files, the VHS tape dubbed to digital. Each piece had been sealed in a manila envelope and marked with the initials CW in bold black marker. He didn't trust email for something like this. Clara had vanished under a digital shadow. This time, the truth would ride on paper and wheels. He met Marlene and Teresa at a coffee shop off Route 12, one of those quiet diners where the regulars barely looked up from their crossword puzzles. Over steaming mugs and clinking spoons, they laid out their final plan. Marlene would deliver a copy to the state attorney's office in Springfield to a former colleague named Deborah Klein, an investigator with a reputation for integrity who had once risked her own career exposing malpractice at a private care home. Teresa would take another set to a local reporter, Evan Rayner, known for his long-form exposés and resistance to corporate pressure. Bobby himself would keep the originals, placing them in a safety deposit box at a bank under Clara's name, a quiet tribute to her and a final layer of protection. They shook hands, no words needed. For the first time since Clara vanished, there was motion. Real, forward, undeniable. By mid-afternoon, Deborah Klein was leaning across her office desk, brows furrowed as she reviewed the documents Marlene had delivered. "Where the hell did you get all this?" she muttered, eyes scanning each page with rising disbelief. "This isn't just negligence. This is criminal enterprise, coordinated fraud. And, my God, there are names in here I recognize. Donors, politicians." Marlene nodded grimly. "We have video evidence, witness testimony. The whole room is intact, hidden in the clinic's lower level." Klein looked up, her face hardening with resolve. "I need to move fast before this leaks. I'll convene a special task force. But I need you to stay quiet for now. If word gets out too soon, they'll bury whatever's left." At the same time, Evan Rayner sat in his newsroom, headphones on, eyes wide as he listened to Clara's cassette. The grainy audio, her trembling voice, the passion in her words. It cut straight through his skepticism. By the end, he leaned back, blinking. He turned to Teresa. "This is one of the most damning things I've ever heard. And the fact that it's been hidden for 13 years, we're going to blow this wide open. But I'll need to verify every document, cross-reference names, dates. And I'll need to protect you all, especially now." Teresa nodded, her fingers clenched around a cup of tea. "We're not running anymore." That evening, Bobby received a call from Klein. "We're moving in tomorrow morning," she said. "Search warrant's been signed by a federal judge. We'll go in at 6 a.m., seize everything, and start arrests immediately. Stay out of sight until then." Bobby agreed, but sleep didn't come easy. He paced his small living room, thinking about Clara, thinking about that last hug outside the clinic, thinking about all the people whose files sat in that secret room, people who never got to tell their stories. He wondered how many families had wondered, like he had, if they'd missed something, if they'd failed someone they loved. At precisely 6 a.m., federal agents, local officers, and state investigators entered Meadow Glen Medical under full authority. They sealed off the building, descended into the basement, and found the archive room exactly as described, intact, untouched, and damning. Over the next several hours, boxes were carried out, servers confiscated, and names confirmed. Within the day, 4 senior staff members were taken into custody, including Dr. Stephen Cates, who had quietly returned to Meadow Glen after a brief sabbatical in Florida. His face twisted with confusion as they read him his rights. By noon, Evan Rayner published a breaking news article. The nurse who never stopped speaking, Clara Whitmore's final gift. Within hours, the story was picked up by regional stations, then national media. Clara's face, once faded into memory, now appeared on every major network. Her voice played over podcasts, her handwritten notes featured in exposés, her story told with reverence and weight. Calls began pouring in from families who had suspected wrongdoings. Lawsuits were filed, medical licenses revoked. The state launched an independent inquiry into similar clinics across the region. But amid the storm of justice, Bobby, Marlene, and Teresa didn't feel triumph. Not exactly. They met again that evening, sitting on the porch of Marlene's house, watching the sun sink behind the trees. It was a warm dusk, the kind Clara would have loved. Fireflies blinking like tiny memories, the air still and fragrant with lilacs. She should be here, Bobby said softly. To see it all. To know she wasn't wrong. Teresa nodded. She never gave up. Not really. She made sure someone would find it when it was time. Marlene reached in her bag and pulled out the cassette tape. We should preserve this, she said. Let people hear her words, her voice. Not just the evidence, but the person. They agreed, and over the next few days, worked with Evan to create a tribute segment. It wasn't flashy. It didn't dramatize. It just told Clara's story in her own voice, with images of her life, her work, and the people she touched. It aired 1 week later. And that night, across the country, millions of people sat quietly, listening. Justice wasn't just a headline. It was a promise fulfilled. The seasons turned quietly after the storm. Meadow Glen Medical was shuttered, its windows boarded and signs removed, now a vacant husk among whispering trees. The town moved forward, slowly and cautiously, like a patient emerging from long illness. But something had changed, not just in headlines or lawsuits, but in the quiet corners of lives previously too afraid to speak. In the months following the revelations, Bobby received dozens of letters. Some from families of former patients, others from nurses who had once worked at Meadow Glen and left in silence. They shared stories, some filled with guilt, others with grief, all tinged with relief that, finally, the truth had a name. And that name was Clara Whitmore. Her voice, once confined to a single cassette, now echoed across conference halls, nursing schools, and even a Senate hearing where Marlene testified under oath. She was just a nurse, she said plainly, her voice catching, but she saw what no one wanted to see. And instead of looking away, she acted. That used to cost you everything. But now, because of Clara, it means something again. The tribute video that aired, Clara's words, layered with soft piano and images of her tending patients, laughing with co-workers, smiling gently in a sunlit corridor, had struck a deep, quiet chord with viewers. It became more than a story. It became a symbol. Medical students wrote essays about her. A small hospital in Vermont named its new ethics library after her. And in her hometown of Millersville, a tree was planted in the square, a plaque beneath it reading, "In memory of Clara Whitmore, a voice for the voiceless." Teresa found her days lighter, not because the guilt had vanished, but because it now had shape. She began volunteering again, this time with an organization that advocated for patient rights. She gave talks at local colleges, speaking not from a place of shame, but from resolve. She no longer hesitated when someone mentioned Clara's name. She spoke it like a hymn. Marlene returned to teaching part-time at the nursing program she once helped build. Her students, most of them barely old enough to remember the year Clara disappeared, now asked thoughtful questions about ethics and integrity. She would share the story, not in dramatic arcs, but in the quiet, human moments that mattered. How Clara noticed patterns no one wanted to see, how she listened to patients with more than her ears, how she never stopped believing the system could be better. The rules won't always save you, Marlene would say, but the truth will guide you, even if it leads through fire. And Bobby, for his part, stayed in Millersville. He never remarried, not because he hadn't tried or wanted to, but because somewhere a part of him still walked beside Clara on those long night shifts. He kept her photograph on his mantle, not the glossy one from her badge, but the candid shot he'd taken the spring before she vanished. Clara sitting on a back porch, coffee mug in hand, grinning at something he'd said. The light had caught her just right that day, haloing her in gold. He sometimes spoke to it at night, softly, as though she were just in the next room. He also kept the original cassette in a fireproof box, along with a handwritten letter Clara had mailed to the ethics board, the one they claimed never arrived. It had resurfaced during the federal investigation, stamped and dated, but buried in an internal office. It was brief, but unmistakable. I can no longer be quiet. What is happening here must stop. I will do what I can until someone listens. And someone finally had. A year after the arrests, the town council proposed a memorial event. At first, it was just meant to honor Clara's legacy, but it grew into something larger, a public acknowledgement of all those who had been lost or silenced in the name of profit or efficiency. They called it the Day of the Voice, and people came from all over: families, nurses, whistleblowers, even former patients. They held candles at dusk. Bobby was asked to speak, but he hesitated until the last moment. When he finally took the podium, the crowd fell into reverent silence. "She was my friend," he began, his voice low but steady. "And she was a nurse. But above all, she was someone who believed that truth should never come second to fear. When she disappeared, the world moved on. But now we know we should never have let her go alone. We hear her now, and we won't forget again." He stepped down as the crowd lit their candles. One by one, soft flames shimmered into being, until the square glowed like a field of stars. In that light, faces turned upward. Tears shimmered quietly, but so did something else: peace. Weeks later, Bobby visited the tree in the square. The leaves had turned golden, fluttering gently in the early autumn wind. He sat on the bench nearby and closed his eyes. He remembered Clara's laugh, the way she hummed while writing charts, how she always stayed a little later to check on one last patient. He could almost feel her there beside him, not as a memory, but as something alive in the wind, in the light, in the world she had helped change. "She did it," he whispered. "You did it." And for a long moment, there was only silence. Then, as if in answer, a soft gust passed through the leaves, and the tree above him swayed with the sound of 1,000 quiet whispers. Echoes. And in them, Clara lived on. "Thank you so much for staying with us, for listening with an open heart, and for honoring her journey with your time. If you found value in this story, we warmly invite you to subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and most importantly, leave a comment below. Share your thoughts, your emotions, or even a personal story of someone who stood up for what was right, no matter the cost. We'd love to hear from you. Your voice matters, just like Clara's did. Until next time, take care of yourselves and one another. And remember, sometimes the softest voices are the ones that carry the farthest.